Do you want me to introduce you, Tracy, or are you happy to just get started?
Well, I don't mind an introduction.
You know,
you
dive in. I just wanted to say thanks again for coming today. Obviously, part of our MCA week. I'm Lizzie Lacey, and I'm Safeguarding Adults Lead and MCA Lead at Lambeth Council. Tracy's been amazing, and she's linked to one of the charities in Southwest London, and has been really helpful in coming to talk to us today. And it's just to say a massive thanks to you as part of our MCA week. So I'll pass over to her because she needs to go within the hour. So I'll pass over to you. Thanks, Tracy.
Thank you. So I'm going to start off with all of you saying thank you for listening. And I'm going to show you with the first couple of slides that I'm going to put my money where my mouth is. I'm passionate about mental capacity, so much so that I've written quite a lot on it. I think it's one of those topics that just starts really good conversations among colleagues. So first slide I'm going to show you is a couple of books I've written. The first one came out in 2019, and I wrote it because as a clinician, I'm really aware that any assessments you do of mental capacity are really just to inform the law, because ultimately it's a legal decision, it's a legal test. And I felt that there was a fantastic body of research and publication in the clinical field and in practitioner field, and a similarly amazing body of literature in the legal field, but they never kind of met. So I wrote the first book, and it was very much about presenting about the Mental Capacity Act, illustrating it with clinical cases, but then getting legal commentary at the end of every case. So it kind of brought the two worlds together. Then the publishers came back to me about 18 months later and said, could I write a much simpler book that would be something that people would like maybe stick in their briefcase or their scrubs pocket or whatever. And so I wanted to call the second one, which came out right at the end of 22, An Idiot's Guide, but the publishers wouldn't let me. But that's kind of what it's meant to be. It's meant to be, if you have any questions, it's a go-to reference book. It's really basic, it's really simple, because I think the Capacity Act is quite simple. So those are my first two publications. And then before that, I'd co-written a chapter in a book which was looking at mental capacity. Excuse me, and I'd also published a couple of papers about what the practical aspects are of assessing mental capacity. And then another angle which I thought isn't really covered is about if you assess somebody and in your initial assessment says that they probably lack capacity, what you can do about it to maybe get them over the line so that they then regain capacity and put them in a position of strength. So that was quite a long time ago, this article that I wrote, but I'm quite proud of it. And the case that I used to write it, I got consent from the person it was based on, and he actually picked his pseudonym. So I was quite pleased with that. It felt as though he was very involved and his voice is in there. So let's start what I'm going to talk to you about today. So I'm a clinician. I'm a consultant clinical neuropsychologist, and I've spent all of my working career around acquired brain injury, not just traumatic brain injury. I've a little bit about myself. So I've worked in the NHS being a consultant lead. I've run a brain injury rehab trust unit as consultant lead. I've worked in the community. I work in private practice. I do expert witness work, and capacity cuts across all of that. I get asked about capacity assessments in every aspect of the work I've done. So I'm not here to teach you today. I'm here to share what I know, and if it's helpful, that's great. So if I start off by saying what I'm going to do is, excuse me, I'm going to first of all start with a really simple look at how we make decisions, how the brain actually makes decisions for us, because we make decisions all the time. From the minute we get woken up by alarm, do we hit snooze? Do we get up? Do we shower? Do we wash our hair today? What are we going to have for breakfast? You know, do we leave at this time? When we get to work, what do we tackle first? We're making decisions all the time. And it helps if you can understand what the mechanisms are really simply in the brain that help us to do that. Because then when we look at brains which are injured, we can work out maybe where things aren't working so well. It's starting from things working well to things working not so well. So just very briefly, I'm not going to test you on any of this, but the red bit at the front of the slide is what we refer to as the frontal lobes. And if you think of the brain as an orchestra, the frontal lobes are the conductor. They kind of bring it all beautifully together. They coordinate, they weigh, they allow us to be flexible in our thinking. They allow us to concentrate. They allow us to think of consequences and to kind of play forward. They allow us to look at previous experience and weigh up if we make this decision, have we made it before? What happened last time? How did that work for us? So it's hugely important in decision making. And the reason I put that up is you'll see as we go through the slides, it's quite a useful just reference point of all the things that we rely on in the frontal lobes to help us function. So a bit more complicated. You don't need to remember the names of these bits. The colours are fine. But these are the three elements of the frontal lobes that are really heavily involved in decision making. And it probably makes more sense if I move to this slide. And I want you to think of those three areas as operating like a seesaw. So at this side, we've got the blue bit, which is the bit that's like, yeah, go and do it. Don't stop and think. Adrenaline junkie, no need to think about it. Let's just do it. And then at the other side, which is the, I'm sorry, I've got my varifocals on, the purple bit. This is the kind of, well, let me just have a think. I did this before, or I know someone else who's done this, or let me look at my options, or what other information might I need? So it's kind of a bit of a pause button. So at the opposite ends of this seesaw, you've got the go for it and you've got the hang on a minute elements. The bit in the middle is actually equally important. That's kind of the fulcrum of your slide. If I move to the next, you can see the seesaw. So this is the bit that will say, well, okay, but what would happen if this was a consequence? And how's this worked out for you in the past? Or, you know, it's kind of weighing the two up. So it's an in-between of the go for it and the pause. And it's a dynamic system that we use all the time, and we're all a bit different. We're wired a bit differently in how we make decisions. Some of us are naturally risk averse. We might be anxious. We might see danger everywhere. Other people are like, well, do it and ask questions after. Those are kind of our characters, and that's how we're wired. And also sometimes we might be more one than the other depending on the circumstance. So it might depend on what company we're in. Maybe we've had a couple of drinks. We're always a bit more free with our decision making when we've had a couple of drinks. Maybe we're, not feeling very well, so we might be a little more risk averse for that reason. So it's a dynamic system that changes. It's different for everybody, and it's different depending on you, how you're feeling, the magnitude of the decision, because there's a big difference between having to decide, do I have a latte now or wait an hour? Or do I buy that house I saw on Saturday that I'm not sure I can stretch the mortgage to? They're very different decisions, aren't they? So I know we talk about decision making, but it does very much depend on the decision. Okay, so I'm trying to get to my next slide. It's not showing on my screen. It should be. I don't know why that's not showing. Oh, here we go. It's because I put animation on it. I didn't realise I'd done that. Okay, so this is just to keep you all awake. Brain injury and decision making. So the first thing you need to know is that no two brain injuries are the same. And I guess you know that. So you might be working with someone who's got maybe ARBD, alcohol-related brain damage. You might be working with someone who's had a stroke. It might be somebody who's had a traumatic brain injury through a car accident or an assault. There are lots of reasons why brains get injured. And so no two brain injuries are the same. No two people who've had a brain injury are the same. So even if you had two people next to each other and you looked at their brain scans and the mechanism of injury and they're identical, people don't respond the same to injury. So everybody's different is the point I guess I'm making. But the one thing you do need to know, and this is from a neuropsychology point of view, and this has been established since the 1960s in the published literature, is that no matter where the brain injury, that orchestra always takes a hit. Sorry, that conductor of your orchestra always takes a hit. So the frontal systems that are involved, as we saw here, all of this can be affected in one way or another if there's a brain injury. So that's quite important to know that. So what that makes you do is if you are asked to assess an individual for whatever reason in your day-to-day practice, and there's a history of a brain injury, it just should make you a little bit curious about what impact that might have had on how they're functioning. So how does all of that, lovely brain pictures, relate to assessing capacity, I hear you say? So I guess one of the things I want to talk about next, so we've done a little bit about what the frontal lobes do, we tied that into how the brain makes decisions. Now we're going to look at two terms that people use interchangeably, but are actually clinically very different. And I'm going to explain that on the next slide. So we're going to look at the difference between awareness and insight. They are absolutely not the same thing. And that's going to feed into the magic words that we all bandy around, frontal lobe paradox. We all hear it. Everybody probably understands something slightly different by it, and I'll explain what it is. And then I'll again put that in the context of assessing somebody's capacity. So insight and awareness. So awareness is the most basic level of knowing that something's not right. So it's where you've got the kind of concrete knowledge of facts. So you might sit with somebody who's had a brain injury and they'll tell you, I've had a brain injury. I know it affects my ability to concentrate, or I know I can't remember things, or I know it makes me a bit irritable, or I know, I'm not the same person I was. So they might have possession of those facts. But insight is where you have those facts and you use that information to inform your behaviours and your decision making. And what happens in frontal lobe paradox, if I whiz to the next slide here, is that there's a disconnect. So over here, we've got the concrete fact that somebody has. So each one of these dots might represent a fact. So that little green button I'm pointing to now might be, I know I've had a brain injury. That little purple one might be, I know I don't concentrate so well. That green one there might be, I get tired easily. But you can see in this graphic, they're not joined up. So that person isn't using that to make their decisions. They're not connecting the dots. So they can talk the talk and say, yeah, I know I've had a brain injury. I know I need a bit of extra time to make decisions, but it's not translated into action. Over this side, we've got awareness. So this is awareness. The bit where they're all joined up is insight. So this is where the person's connecting them up, which is like, yeah, I've got a brain injury and I know I forget things. So that means actually what I need to do is make sure that I write them down. So it's that extra step. So if I just go back to that one for you. So that's the concrete, unjoined up knowledge. And that's where the person's able to use the information to affect their decision making. Frontal lobe paradox is where there's a disconnect between the two. So, but not all disconnects are bad. So I've got a favourite judge in the Court of Protection that I love reading his judgments. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm a bit of a nerd like that. He's called Justice Hayden, and he wrote last year a really helpful distinction for lawyers to understand that, we all make silly decisions. We all do things that we know probably aren't a great idea. So maybe we spend more money than we should each month, maybe go a bit overdrawn. Maybe we dip into the holiday money to buy something that we think we want. Maybe we eat more calories than we know we need, even though we're not happy with what size we are. Whatever, we all make decisions that probably would be unwise. And don't really make sense in terms of our aspirations, but we can make them. We have free will. And psychologists use a technical term called cognitive dissonance for that. And the most common example of cognitive dissonance is, I know smoking's bad for me, but I'm going to smoke anyway, kind of thing. But the law is saying that's fine. You leave people alone. They still have capacity, even if they're cognitively dissonant. Where it becomes a problem is where they're not aware that that disconnect is in place. And that's where we know this is what we call the frontal lobe paradox. So going on to this, it's this disconnect between the knowing and the doing, between the talking the talk and walking the walk. It's also been described, somewhere in the literature as online and offline awareness. Sometimes people call it that as well. So here's a basic definition for you, which I think I've just covered. It's when the person can't select the right bits of information and use them to underpin what decisions they're trying to make. And that's why this is important in capacity assessments, because we know that if there's any kind of brain injury, however long ago, that somebody's frontal systems might be not working as well as they were before. The wiring might be a bit different, there might be gaps. And so we need to be asking, we need to be curious. I talk a lot about the importance of curiosity when you're assessing capacity. And I think as professionals, that is the safest position we can adopt, is just to be curious. Okay, so when your seesaw breaks, this system, with this lovely dynamic system that we rely on daily, doesn't work so well. And if you think about your clinical caseloads, I'm assuming you're all clinicians, practitioners. If you think of people that you come across in your professional life, we can all think of someone who just makes very rash, impulsive decisions and gets into a bit of a pickle. Consequences come back that they haven't been able to foresee. Sometimes we get people who can't act. They literally can't make a decision. They're indecisive. They're stuck. They're too reflective. They're kind of perseverative, and they kind of get stuck. And sometimes the weighing up is broken, so they kind of can't connect with previous experiences that they've had and think about previous consequences they might have faced. So when this system's broken, I mean, it would be the same for any of us listening today. You can see how decision making can become unstuck quite quickly. We can really do things which can be harmful to us, for example. So how do we place that? Knowing how the system should work, that lovely dynamic seesaw, and if it's broken or just, you know, one end is a bit heavier than the other and it's not weighted as neutrally as it should be, how do we put that in the context of looking at somebody's capacity? And just pause for a personal reflection here for me, I think. I was very interested in the Mental Capacity Act from when it was first drafted, and it was drafted several years before it actually became law. And at the time, so it had inherited a historical position where people who were deemed to have lack of capacity had absolutely no rights. There was no empowerment. There was no support. You had a clinical diagnosis and it was automatically assumed you lack capacity. And so people's ability to kind of self-empower had gone. And I think when the Act first came in, that was the picture that was inherited. And I think it's taken quite a while for the autonomy agenda to actually gain some traction and the empowerment agenda, but it's definitely there now and it's fabulous to see. You'll see from some of the slides I'm going to put up, this Justice Hayden that I love reading about in the Court of Protection. He is very much about autonomy, autonomy, autonomy. And I've put some, if any of you are nerdy like me and want to look at the judgments, I've put the references in. So for me now, the agenda has moved from when it first started, and it's now very much about how, as practitioners, do we walk that tightrope between empowering someone and giving them enough autonomy, but also making sure that they don't get themselves into difficulties. And I think that's a challenge as practitioners that we face every day in our assessments. Then I'm going to look a little bit about what elements of the test of mental capacity are probably the ones you should have in the forefront of your mind with a brain injury, and what advice is there for us, because we all kind of want to know how to do it properly. So the empowerment and protection imperative, the person's in the middle there, and we have to make sure that there's a nice space for them, because I don't know about all your experiences, but the majority of my clinical experiences, I come across individuals who've had brain injuries, and before their brain injury, which happened in a moment, they were living lives like you and I. Nobody leaves the house in the morning thinking, I'm going to be ventilated tonight because I've had a massive car accident, or, you know, I've had a huge brain bleed and they're fighting to save my life in the theatre, in the hospital. None of us leave home thinking that. So most of the people I come across are like us, functioning fine, working, socialising, living our best life, and then it can be sudden. And so I think adjusting to that for people is as difficult as adjusting to the actual physical issues that arise from a brain injury. So we have a duty, I think, to be aware of that when we're meeting with people, and to be really careful that we're not disempowering anybody when we're assessing their capacity. So these are two quotes from Justice Hayden. Those are legal judgments. If you look them up, I mean, I'm quite happy to find them if anybody wants them, but the legal judgments are there. If you put them in Google, they'll come up. And he said in 2019 that the recognition of the Act is that human autonomy is the defining principle of it, and don't you forget it. And he's now even more strongly said 4 years later that every judge who has, at the Court of Protection, who has a COP3 form or a COP form in front of him, or an application to pass an order, they have in front of them a resolve to make sure that the person has capacity, and they need to be absolutely convinced that they don't. only when the evidence demands it. So you can see just in this one judge's judgments that he's put forward that the move is very much in terms of autonomy and empowerment. And I think that's fabulous. The difficulty is that makes our job really hard, because I think, you know, if we all have a duty of care to the people that we're assessing, and we have to try and make sure that, you know, that they're safe. There's an element of protectionism and safety that we have to have that in our minds as well. So I think it's really helpful to know that the judges in the Court of Protection are saying autonomy, autonomy, empowerment, empowerment, and that guides us. But there's also that safety imperative, and we are walking that tightrope in a lot of cases. I mean, I only see complex capacity assessments, and, you know, interesting and intellectually challenging as they are, I never lose sight of the fact that this is somebody's life and that could be me. And how would I want people to listen to me, I guess. So moving on, excuse me, I did say that there are 4 limbs, aren't there, that we look at in the functional test, where we look at understanding somebody's ability to make a decision after a brain injury. So there's 4 elements. They have to understand, remember it, use or weigh it, and communicate it. And the use or weigh are slightly separate, and they're treated as separate in law, but we talk about them as one thing. And I think here the 2 things that we need to think about in terms of this disconnect between having the facts and being able to use the facts to put them forward to help our decision making are these 2 elements here: to understand and to weigh up. If you remember, if I whiz back, right back to, excuse me, I'll find it. This. What we know of the frontal lobes is that we're self-monitoring, we're self-regulating, we're looking ahead, we're evaluating risk, we're holding information, we're jumping around between possible solutions to this problem we're trying to solve, we're organising the steps that we would have to take. We need to get started, and we can think of things in the abstract. If any part of that system isn't working, it just makes it so much harder for people. Sorry, I'm going to whiz back to where we were. Right, here we go. So the code of practice helps us a little bit as well. I always think there are lots of things wrong with the code of practice, but there's some things in there which are really helpful. So I've pulled out a couple of paragraphs which I think help us to go back to when we're trying to justify why we might be taking longer over a capacity assessment than our managers might want, or why, you know, we might disagree with other professionals about whether or not somebody has capacity. So sometimes people can make a specific decision without using the information that they have. So this is where they've got the facts, but they're not even using those. Sometimes people might make impulsive decisions, think of the broken seesaw, regardless of their information that they've been given and regardless of the fact that they understand it. They can't, their go button has no stop to it. So when the seesaw is broken. So the code of practice kind of helps us here. And there's another one as well. And I think this is quite important. This is when I come across the frontal lobe paradox in action, it's usually in somebody who presents as so capable. And the code of practice said, look, just because somebody has good social skills, they're polite, they don't interrupt, they listen to what you say, they're articulate, they might be polite. It doesn't mean that they can understand the information or use and weigh it up to make decisions. So we have to be careful that we're looking beyond what we see, is what that's saying. So if we're starting an assessment of somebody's capacity, sometimes we might know the person well, they might have been on our caseload for a while. Sometimes we're coming to it and we've never met them before, and that happens quite often. So what we do is, I guess, is we look at what the person says compared with what they do. And one of the things I learned a long time ago is not just what the person can and can't do, but what they won't do. Because sometimes they have all the information, they can do it, they just won't do it. I don't like using this word perform because I think a capacity assessment is best described, in my view, as a conversation. I get asked to assess a lot of people's capacity and I turn up and they're so anxious because they think it's a test they have to pass. And for me, I always describe it as, look, we're just going to have a conversation. I'm going to be a bit nosy. You can answer my questions if you like, but I'm just going to be curious and ask you things. So, but it's still important to see how somebody does. You know, do they remember something you might have talked about a couple of minutes ago, for example? What do the people working with them, so that could be staff or carers, families, what do they see? What do they tell you? Because we're looking, I guess, at patterns and what are the concerns that have been raised in the first place? Obviously, that's a starting point because capacity assessments have to arise from a concern because there is a presumption of capacity. So if I'm doing one, so I'm telling you how I as a neuropsych would assess them, and there are lots of similarities here between what we all do. So have a conversation with the person to start with. Their voice has to be central to the assessment if they'll participate. Ask people around them. Watch the person. How do they behave? How do they engage? How, you know, do they feel, do they come across as though they're kind of aware of what's going on, what the issues are, what people's concerns might be? I would do a neuropsychological assessment as well, which will involve tests of cognitive function, for example. I'd also look at what medication are they on. That's one of the first questions I ask. You know, sometimes medication can affect how you think, how you concentrate. If you're on medication to help you sleep, mornings aren't great for an assessment because you kind of wake up a bit foggy. What's their general health like? You know, are they eating okay? Are they functioning okay? Do they have any underlying serious health conditions which can affect how they're functioning? And then the other place to start is what kind of decisions are they making now? So if I get asked to go and assess someone's capacity to manage their money, I'll say, well, you know, do they manage any money now? Do they make any financial decisions now? Do they, you know, do they do any shopping now? Are they responsible for online banking now? Do they know their PIN number? So just do a bit of fact finding as well, because that's important because the person might tell you they're doing things that they're actually not, or they might tell you they're capable of doing things that they're actually not. Similarly, they might tell you things that they're doing and there's evidence that they're doing them fine. But I think it is just making sure that you don't just have one dimension of information. So just quickly for a slide, I've just summarised very quickly in a neuropsychological assessment. It's very similar to what I just described. So we'd look at what someone's reporting or what someone else is reporting about them. We'd use our eyes and see what's going on. We'd take a history and look at medication. We'd do some tests, put the data through a couple of filters, and then we look at how brains function when they're not injured and then say, well, this isn't right or this is fine. So it's really just there to show you that nobody should just rely on one source of information when they're doing a capacity assessment, because I think that's quite unsafe. So a little bit of what you might think about when you're doing an assessment. So a key component of a capacity assessment is it's educative. So for example, when I was on the ward that I left a couple of years ago, it was a post-acute brain injury rehab ward. So people would come to us who might still be in post-traumatic amnesia and still be quite confused. But, you know, we'd get asked, OK, we need to start making discharge plans. We need to start talking to the local authority, or we need to start talking to providers about that. Can you go and do a discharge assessment of someone's capacity for discharge? And the first thing I'd always say to them is, well, what information have you given them about what their options are? And invariably, it would be not very much. You cannot do an assessment of somebody's ability to make a decision as to where they go on discharge, where they'd like to go, or what options they have, if you haven't actually shared them with the person. And it's about making sure they understand what each option means for them as well. So, for example, this option might mean, you know, you get a private room, you get a lovely garden, you can take your cat, but your family will be 80 miles away and might only be able to visit once a week, for example. Excuse me. Then there's a therapeutic component as well for all practitioners when we do an assessment, because there's always a consequence to the outcome of the assessment. So the person might be really motivated throughout their rehabilitation or their placement to think, right, if I do this, if I jump through all these hoops, if I engage, if I make an effort, I'll be able to go home. And part of your assessment might be, well, actually, I'm afraid you're never going to go home. And that is an enormous loss for some people that you need to be aware of as you're going into the assessment. And so there's a therapeutic kind of educative empathic element to the process, and it's a further loss if that's the outcome. And I would say as well that it has to be collaborative. You have to work alongside the person. I know this sounds quite idealistic, and I recognise it's not always possible. For example, if you're working with somebody and assessing their capacity and their insight is non-existent, and they don't accept that they have care needs, or they don't accept that they have a brain injury, or they don't accept that they have difficulties that people are concerned about. I do understand that that's difficult, but I think we have to try and be collaborative in this assessment and recognise the importance of what we're doing in a capacity assessment. So, for example, one case that I sometimes present, I'm not today, but was a lady who was a foreign national who was a dentist in this country, and her daughter still lived in the country of origin. But this dentist walked in front of a bus. She looked the wrong way crossing the road, and she had a horrific head injury, was never going to work again. But she had a partner in this country, and the partner who was in this country, and they lived together, and the daughter hated each other and accused each other of financial irregularities and mismanagement and taking money from her account. And so when I was doing an assessment of her in terms of her ability to manage her finances, I was very aware of that and had to manage that with her and listen to what she felt about that, because she was aware that this battle was going on around her. So I think it's always about getting to know the person and what their thinking is. So how do we avoid being overprotective? I mean, I am aware that for a lot of us, we come into contact with a lot of people with complex needs, and it can be very difficult to not want to just rescue the person, protect them from the harm that's going on around them, see them as vulnerable. But I think in order for that not to be our starting point, is that we just have to see the person as more than the brain injury. So somebody might have a brain injury but still have lots of strengths, for example, even though they might have impairments. Excuse me. One of the things I used to see written in medical notes, which used to drive me crazy, was the person can't have capacity because they're on a DOLS. And a DOLS is not about decision making. But a lot of, I think, professionals, colleagues can conflate that. So I think we have to say each decision, as far as we can make it, is individual and specific. There are often interrelated ones, such as capacity to have contact with a certain person, capacity to have sex, capacity to enter into a relationship. Similarly, it might be capacity around social media. So I think there are lots of capacity decisions that kind of feed into each other. So but we have to try to see each decision in its own light if we can, even if we then have to put it into a bigger jigsaw. I think for me as well, it's about just be transparent. I don't think that there's a rule book we can follow, and I don't think there's a template that everyone can follow. We all have forms to fill in, but sometimes the forms actually hamper the assessment and make it a bit more complicated because the person might not fit the form, or their circumstances might not fit the form. So I say it's about, excuse the awful metaphor, lining up your ducks in a row or your squirrels in a row. Be transparent from the beginning, where the concern came from, where your referral or assessment question came from. Write down what the specific assessment question is. Write down how you've assessed it, what resources you've used, how many times you visited, how you took account of the person's difficulties and gave them the most scaffolding you could. And then eventually, when you've done all of that, show your reasoning in your decision as to whether you think the person lacks capacity or has capacity, and then write your assessment outcome at the end. So it's kind of linear in how you write it up and how you report it. And I think that's really important, so that it's clear, so that if someone comes after you and picks up your assessment, they can go, oh, okay, I see what they did here, and there's no questions. I mean, I do recognise that we're in the real world. We don't always have time to write 17-page reports on every capacity assessment. I don't mean that. I think it's just about being transparent and being accountable for the decision that you make at the end. Okay, so be mindful of the following. I'm sorry the print is so small. It's just, I wanted to make sure that if anybody wanted the slides afterwards and they haven't heard me talk, they could kind of see what I was getting at. So, but I think the draft code of practice helps with the first point, which is, people might need scaffolding around them, support around them. So, are they at their best? Is it the right time of day? Are they in the right environment? Are they relaxed with you? Are they tired? Are they in pain? Look at all the non-verbal elements as well. And if necessary, use communication aids. I'm doing an assessment next week of a chap I've assessed a couple of times, and he's completely non-verbal. And so we use lots of laminated pictures and decision trees and boards, and And that feels, you know, it's lovely to have the luxury of that. But actually, I've been able to assess him as having capacity. It's just he just can't communicate and in a standard way. And the assessments take a long time, but it's about protecting somebody as well and protecting their autonomy, like Justice Hayden says. I think one of the concerns I get is I'm always mindful of suggestibility, and that doesn't always have to be overt. So somebody might want to make a decision, the person you're assessing might want to make a decision to please somebody, even if it's not quite what they want or what they think is right for them, but they just want to make sure, or they don't want to hurt or offend somebody. And that influence might not be consciously exerted on the part of the person who's exerting it. Like, you know, they might want to please a partner or not disappoint a parent or child, or so I think it's just be mindful of that. Again, I've mentioned about medicines and health. It's just about holding that in mind. I know, you know, none of us are medics, but we are aware that if somebody's on polypharmacy and they're on 15 medications, there's a possibility that that might be affecting their ability to concentrate, or, you know, making them very tired, or, you know, any of those things we just need to be aware of. And if there's any underlying health condition, for example, poorly controlled diabetes affects the frontal lobe functioning, for example. Okay, so this is just, I've lifted this from one of my books. It's just a little table. It's just like a checklist you can have in your mind, really, which is quite helpful. So you're being asked to assess somebody's capacity to make a decision. What do they decide now? Is the decision urgent? So, and I'll talk about this in a minute on the next slide about fluctuating capacity. If it's not an urgent decision and the person's not at their best, wait until they are, help them get to where they are. Is it a one-off decision, or is it part of a process that they're having to decide, what the Court of Protection calls performative decisions? So, for example, financial decisions are often performative because you make a decision and the outcome of that decision might have an implication for other funds or budgets. Or so have you given the person all of the relevant information for them to make the decision that you're assessing, and in the way that suits them? Have you provided all the necessary support? Do they want somebody with them? Can they have somebody with them? Do they understand there are consequences if they don't make a decision, because that's also their right? And can the decision be put off until circumstances change? So they're just kind of things to bear in mind, I guess. So one of the things which I always get asked about is this idea about fluctuating capacity, and I'm not an expert. I've read quite a bit on it, and I've read lots of different things on it. Who's been really most helpful is Alex Rutkeen, who's a barrister in Essex Street Chambers in London. They produce lots of newsletters and really accessible. You can subscribe to them. I think it's 39 Essex Street, but I always want to say 37, but I think it's 39. If you Google it, they literally do a monthly newsletter, and he talks about fluctuating capacity quite a lot, which is really helpful.
It is 39.
Oh, thank you very much.
No worries, I've subscribed, so they're very good, yeah.
Yeah. So if the decision's a one-off, can it wait? If it's performative and the person's capacity is fluctuating, then what you need to look at is the individual's context, I guess. So if you know that the person has fluctuating capacity, such as, for example, poorly controlled diabetes, where sometimes their blood sugars are okay and they can decide, is it somebody when they're going through a period of alcohol misuse or abstinence? So if you know, or somebody is floridly mentally unwell, but there are periods when their symptoms are under control, then really what you need to do is work with the person to put plans in place that they're comfortable with for when they know capacity might fluctuate, if you possibly can. However, the Court of Protection will say that if capacity fluctuates significantly, then, you know, it might just be that a welfare order is needed. But again, it comes back to that idea of offering as much support and scaffolding as you can and working collaboratively with the person. A little bit about best interests. I think you covered this yesterday according to the timetable, but I'm sorry I didn't, I wasn't there. So what I have learned is that what best interest isn't, and I thought that would be quite helpful. So it's not what the person would have decided but for their brain injury or mental health problem. The law is very clear on that. It's not about their wishes being given primary importance, and it's not about trying to protect the person. So it's at best, you have to be really careful. There's some really good things published about how to do a best interests assessment. There's lots of balance sheets out there, and I think they're really helpful. I've been involved in chairing best interest meeting, and the pros and the cons are a really good way of arriving at what you need to and consulting all the right people. So it's a systematic process. It involves people, the person, those who have professional knowledge. It clearly lays out the options, and the decision maker needs to be really clearly identified. So back to Justice Hayden. I feel like I'm a groupie. I'm not. I just like what he says because it kind of it resonates with me. So it's really about protecting autonomy. So I've got two quite brief case examples. They're only a slide each, but I just want to talk to you about a couple of cases I've been involved in. I've anonymized them. They're not identifiable. Just to kind of start some discussion, really, because I have to go at, I'm an hour ahead of you, so it's 20 to 5 with me, but I have to go at 5 o'clock my time. Excuse me. So I'm just going to present two, and I'm going to leave the slides up to explain. I can talk around them a little bit more. So this is a gentleman who is probably in his early 60s, I think. So in 2007, he had quite a very severe brain injury, fell off a horse, was in hospital and rehab for months and months, was left with quite significant cognitive impairments, physical impairments, but had just, excuse me, kind of got to the point where he was starting to get his life back in order when he was on a motorbike that was struck by a car, and he had a second head injury. This second one was a lot more moderate, but obviously it's against the backdrop of the first one, so a lot of the impact has been compounded. So again, he had inpatient and community rehab, which has been completed. And some of the issues have arisen over his ability to make decisions around, he lives independently, but he's independently wealthy and was before the accident. He doesn't need to work. He lives what I've described as a low demand lifestyle. So he has nothing particular to get up for, no particular rush to be anywhere, doesn't have to jump through any hoops for anybody, can kind of decide what he wants to do. So he is not really under any pressure to make any decisions. He does manage his own finances independently. He said was going to have a financial settlement in a personal injury claim from the second TBI, and said, "Oh, it's okay. I'll take his advice. I'll ask my sister." And I was talking to him with his brother in the room, and the brother kind of raised an eyebrow and looked at me meaningfully. And so I thought, right, okay, that's a signal for me to ask some questions. And the sister had been estranged from AA for something like 12 years. So he was extremely unlikely to approach this estranged sister for advice. And so thought the brother, who was, involved in helping in his life. So that was the first kind of red flag that I had. So I put a pin in that. And then the more questions and kind of asking and looking around I did, there were decisions coming to light which were maybe a little bit questionable. So after his second injury and accident, he was physically unable of riding motorbikes anymore because of hemiplegia. But he'd gone out and bought another 2 motorbikes, which he couldn't ride. And so again, that was something I kind of put a pin in and thought, okay, that's information. And then concerns were raised about, he lives independently, but the brother was saying, yeah, that sounds great on paper, but you go to his house and it's dirty and it's cluttered. He's got all these cables across the lounge, which are a massive trip hazard, and he cannot afford to fall again, especially as he was hemiplegic. But he was like, no, I don't need a cleaner. I'm happy. I've got the house how I want it. And I can make my own decisions. And I'm not going to tell you what we decided, but I'm presenting this as a case where we were kind of thinking the evidence was starting to stack up that some of his decision making was a little bit faulty. And I guess the discussion with other people involved in his life, including his brother, who he used as an advocate, and the rehab team who'd only recently kind of discharged him, was just asking about, well, let's pull together information that's underpinning these concerns about his decision making. And let's see where we go with that. I think somebody's just put a hand up, I just saw. I don't know if that's somebody about this specific question. I don't know. I can't see everybody.
Okay. Do you have a question?
Oh,
Accident. Okay, you carry on, Tracey.
I was expecting a really amazing question then.
Me
Okay.
too.
You may still get some, don't
I
worry.
may still get some. Okay, so I'll leave that one with you. This next one, completely different case. So this was an incredibly high achieving, incredibly intelligent man, another motorbike accident. His partner was also a medic, very supportive, incredibly reliable, just wonderful to work with clinically. Lots of rehab in hospital, various hospitals, lots of rehab at home. But people were starting to raise concerns about his actual independent ability to make decisions about money. So prior to the injury, him and his partner had made all their decisions together. They kind of brought the same amount of resources to the pot as in their partnership. There was absolutely no reason to doubt the motives of the partner at any point. But the more professionals talked to BB, the more they realised that actually what the picture now wasn't codependent decision making. It was subservient, acquiescent decision making. Sorry, it was codependent. I got my words mixed up. So he wasn't independently making a decision, his partner making a decision, them coming together, talking about it and both agreeing. The partner would say, this is the decision we have to make. I think we should do this. And BB would go, okay, yeah, that sounds great. And that's in principle, that sounds okay. But a couple of times, and the most startling one of which was they were moving and there were huge issues around the chain and the finances and decision making and timing. And the decision was made that the house they were living in had sold, the house they were moving into, everything was about to fall apart. So the partner, the non-injured partner, had to buy the property in their own name initially, and then make sure that half was transferred to BB after the move, or they'd have lost the property. And a couple of people said, I'm a bit uncomfortable with that, because if something had happened to the partner or the relationship had broken down before that could be done, the BB wasn't protected. And so questions were kind of asked about that. And again, the reason I picked these two cases is that nobody agreed on either case as to whether the person had or retained or lacked capacity. So I guess what I'm doing is acknowledging the fact that, you know, it'd be lovely to get cases that were so straightforward, we could just do a job, write a report, and it would be done and everyone would agree, because it doesn't happen like that all the time. So I finished all the slides I was going to present to you, and we've got about 10 minutes if anybody wants to ask anything. I can't promise to answer it, but I can always try. I'll stop sharing my screen as well. How do I do that? Let me see. Might need to
Tracey. Yeah, I think we've got a couple of people, so yeah, go for it.
Brilliant. I can't.
Colin?
I can't.
You want to go first, Colin?
Hi, did you want me?
Yeah, please.
It might be a bit out of the box, because obviously you're telling us about capacity, which is really good. But obviously we read a lot of varying things, and we experience a lot of varying things when we're actually trying to put capacity through.
Yeah.
The predominantly problem that we see is that quite a lot of the time the look is to assist the client, and that can make it very awkward when we're passing in saying this person's got capacity, when you have someone else coming in going, well, I don't think so, because when they asked that question, I was even accused of leading, because I'd already seen the client previously, and I asked them the same questions to clarify, did you say that? Because the second person had just walked in, I was accused of leading the person. I said, well, that's what you need to do. It's not about trying to, and that's the bit I get confused at. It's that obscure part where when you can see there's a problem, but you're not quite sure what the problem is or how you're going to help that person. And often helping them is saying they don't have capacity for that little bit, which actually solves the problem and makes their life easier. Yeah. And we don't want to do that, but at the same time, it causes, that's all it is.
That's a good point though, Colin. I think there's a couple of points there. One is that's why I'm saying earlier in the talk is about being transparent, showing your reasoning, writing up what you did so that it's transparent and you're accountable for what you did. And you're never going to please everybody. I mean, I've been physically threatened by a family member. Literally across the table, somebody tried to grab me in a meeting because they didn't agree with something. And I know that's unusual, but it does happen. So I think it's about being accountable. And I think the other thing I'd say is, and I probably didn't touch on this in the talk, is that it's not always a permanent position where you say this person lacks capacity. Because one of the things I do when I fill in COP3 forms is say, well, they lack capacity at the moment, but if you did this, this and this, it would be worth having another look. So I think it's a thankless job, Colin, but I think it can be really rewarding when you get it right.
Thanks for that, Tracy.
Cheers.
And we've got Laura.
Oh, sorry, there's two of you talking.
No, Laura, sorry, my fault. I'll let you do it,
Hi.
Jennifer.
Thank you very much for the session. It's very helpful. I want to share an example of something that happened when I was supporting somebody. So I was asked to assess somebody who was in a care home. They went there after a stroke and the care home was closing, so we were looking at to a move. And this person was under adults. Extremely difficult to engage. This was a very angry person because they didn't want to be in the care home. It was very difficult to assess the capacity because they weren't engaging. So I had to do a lot of work on deduction, kind of looking at the whole picture. And one of the things that, they were saying, looking at the medical records to start with, this person was recorded in the care home as having dementia. They had a stroke. That is not the same thing. So they didn't have really a diagnosis as a long-term condition because he had a stroke. We don't know what was the recovery that he have made since. He was doing things that somebody who lacked capacity, I wouldn't expect to do. Like they didn't like the meals on the care home. They were arranging those meals themselves. So it's like kind of executive capacity. So I ended doing a joint visit with the dolls team. But because again, he wasn't engaged, he lacked capacity. So I had to write a really long capacity assessment with all the information. And eventually he was taken from the dolls. He wasn't under dolls anymore. And he went back home where he wanted to be. And he then engaged with everybody. So it's just one of these things that is, again, not assuming just because he's under adults, he has capacity. Yes. If you have any query, just look at the medical records and look at actions and what are the things that are happening for the person's life. So
that's exactly right, Lo. That's exactly right. What you did was a really good job, because I think, if that had been you or I, and I was in a care home on adults, I'd be bloody furious.
I know. That's why he didn't want to talk to me. He was under the blanket. Every time I will go there, he will be under the blanket. And I engaged the family. They told him off because I was like, I'm trying to help you here. If you don't talk to me, I cannot help you. So yes, it's kind of frustrating, but we need to be. But again, as well, I had a really good manager at the time, and I went, this is what's happening. And they were like, okay, write a capacity assessment. I will help you. I will support you to challenge the dolls. But it's
and I think as well, there's been a shift in dolls. So like I said, I worked in a unit, and on a ward for quite a while, and so we had a lot of people there who were on a dolls. And there was a shift in the dolls assessors I saw, where they were like, well, okay, we'll give you 3 months, but I want to see what you're going to do about getting them off it. And I loved that challenge. And we did it with a couple of quite difficult people, because you become a bit comfortable if someone's on a dolls, don't you? And I think it's, and what you need to do is be challenging yourself. So, I haven't got time to tell you now, but I've got a really good case example of when we had somebody who had a massive brain injury from a drugs overdose and an assault. Was really not safe, was misusing. We had to have her kind of in a locked unit, and she was on a dolls, and we got her out into the community, having like half an hour at a time, and being safe, unsupervised. And that was like a 6-month piece of work, but I'm so pleased we did it.
Yeah, it's great, isn't it, when you see a good result?
It is.
Thank you, Laura. So Leah, would you like to come in with your question? You're on mute if you're speaking,
Yeah.
Saleha.
Sorry, yeah. Hi, thank you for that. I just had a query around the distinction between awareness and insight and how that relates kind of to the 4-point test. So I've previously been on MCA training where you know we were advised that the threshold for kind of understanding information is low in terms of you know the awareness element, that a basic understanding of you know what the decision is. So for example, you know, I might have a client and I might, you know, give them the information and they will understand that they have a 4 times a day care package, that carers visit them 4 times a day, but then they would lack insight into, you know, the reasons for that, to use and weigh up that information. So
Yeah.
I think my basic question was, if someone has the awareness, does that constitute understanding, you know, for purposes of the Mental Capacity Act, but the lack of insight relates to more of the using and weighing up information? I just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, no, it's a lovely distinction, but it's not always that straightforward. I think it can depend on the decision, but that is a useful way of looking at it. Yeah, because somebody can give you the concrete facts, which shows that they have awareness of a brain injury and what the issues are, and it is the use or weigh. It's using that information to then inform. Yeah, it's a useful way of looking at it. You know, the only thing is, Saleha, when we come up with these lovely little formulae, there's always an exception to the rule.
Yeah, it's not always that straightforward. No, I understand.
Yeah, no, that's good though. I like that. I'm going to have to go, I'm afraid. Unless
No,
there's
it's okay.
another
That's
burning
actually
question.
perfectly worked out, because
That
we've now
worked out.
got no more people with hands up. So just to say a massive thank you, Tracy. We're going to do just a little feedback form, if people can fill that in, which Jenny will launch now. I'll
Thank
stay
you.
on if anyone wants to ask any questions of me, but if not, then it was just to say thanks so much, and to plug that we have another 3 sessions to come, one around supported decision making, one around advocacy, and one around executive functioning for the rest of the week. So do attend and come and discuss some cases. It would be very useful. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tracy. That was brilliant.
Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Thank
Tracy. Thank you.
Thanks,
Can everyone please fill
Thank
out the
you.
form, the poll that's just gone out? There are 4 questions before you run off.
Hi, Laura. Are you okay?
Sorry.
Well,
I'm trying to talk and I am muting myself.
that's all right.
I cannot see the questions.
Yeah, the questions aren't coming up for me either. I was just wondering about that.
I get
a
tick and a cross.
Yeah.
Yes. So
I thought.
thank you for saying, Laura. I'm not sure what I'm doing wrong then, because it's launching.
Yeah, I don't know.
I can't see the questions either.
Can you see the questions, the full questions, anyone? If you go into it. I'm just going to see. It doesn't actually give us, you know, it says usually you've got like a word
New
cloud like you
teams.
did before.
I'll send a poll out with the papers.
Yeah, do. That will be really helpful. So yeah, don't worry,
So
everyone.
it's depending on which teams you have on, then maybe, isn't it?
Maybe. The only thing I can
So we're going to be sharing the slides, and what we'll do is we'll send out a little